Sarah Martinez had always been told she wasn't cut out for the military. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with gentle brown eyes and soft-spoken demeanor, she looked more like someone who belonged in a library than on a battlefield. Her family thought she was crazy when she enlisted in the Army at 19, fresh out of high school in small-town Texas. "You're too sweet for that world," her grandmother had warned, clutching her rosary beads. "War changes people, mija. It hardens hearts," but Sarah had different plans. She wanted to save lives, not take them. When the recruiter explained the role of a combat medic, something clicked. She could serve her country while staying true to her values of helping others. The idea of being the person who rushed toward danger to pull wounded soldiers to safety appealed to her sense of purpose. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was brutal. Sarah struggled with the physical demands while excelling in her medical coursework. She memorized every bone in the human body, learned to stop bleeding in 30 seconds, and practiced emergency procedures until they became second nature. Her drill sergeant, a gruff veteran named Rodriguez, initially dismissed her as another bleeding heart who won't last a week in the field. "Martinez," he would bark during morning formations. "You think the enemy cares about your gentle touch? You think they'll wait while you say pretty please before shooting at you?" The other recruits weren't much kinder. Some questioned whether someone who refused to carry a weapon beyond her standard-issue pistol could handle the realities of combat. Sarah had made it clear from day one that she viewed herself as a healer, not a warrior. She carried her medical bag with the same reverence others carried their rifles. During field exercises, Sarah proved her worth in ways that silenced some critics. When Private Johnson collapsed from heat exhaustion during a 20-mile march, she was the first to reach him, establishing an IV line while others were still catching their breath. When Corporal Williams dislocated his shoulder during obstacle course training, she had him stabilized and ready for transport in minutes. Her instructors began to notice something special about Martinez. She had an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure, her hands never shaking even during the most intense medical simulations. While other medics fumbled with equipment when adrenaline kicked in, Sarah became more focused, more precise. "She's got ice water in her veins," Sergeant First Class Thompson observed during one particularly challenging exercise. "Never seen anything like it." The philosophy Sarah carried was simple but firm. Her job was to preserve life, not destroy it. She studied the Geneva Convention rules about medical personnel, memorizing her rights and responsibilities as a non-combatant. According to military doctrine, medics were protected under international law as long as they stuck to their healing role and didn't engage in direct combat. "My rifle stays holstered unless it's life or death," she told her bunkmate, Private Kelly Chen, one evening as they cleaned their gear. "I didn't join this army to kill people. I joined to bring them home alive." Chen, a sharpshooting specialist from California, shook her head. "Sarah, you're going to deploy to Afghanistan next month. Over there, everyone's a target. The Taliban don't care about your Geneva Convention." But Sarah remained steadfast in her beliefs. She practiced her marksmanship enough to qualify, but everyone knew her heart wasn't in it. During weapons training, she would complete the minimum requirements, then spend extra hours in the medical training facility, perfecting her trauma care techniques. Her medical instructor, Captain Davis, a former combat medic himself, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Martinez, I've been in 3 deployments, saved a lot of lives, lost some too. You've got the skills to be one of the best medics I've ever trained. But you need to understand something." Sarah straightened, expecting another lecture about the realities of war. "In combat, the lines blur," Davis continued. "Sometimes saving lives means taking lives. Sometimes being a healer means being a warrior. Don't let your principles get your squad killed." The warning stuck with her, but Sarah remained convinced she could serve effectively while maintaining her core beliefs. She spent her final weeks of training volunteering at the base hospital, working with wounded veterans returning from overseas deployments. Their stories were harrowing, but they reinforced her determination to be the person who could bring soldiers home in one piece. 2 weeks before deployment, Sarah received her orders. She would be attached to Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, heading to a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. The region had seen increased Taliban activity, and casualties were mounting. They needed experienced medics who could handle trauma under fire. The night before leaving, Sarah video called her family back home. Her parents had finally come around to supporting her decision, though worry creased their faces on the small screen. Her younger brother, Miguel, had just started his senior year of high school. "Bring everyone home safe, Hermana," he said, trying to sound tough but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "That's exactly what I plan to do," Sarah replied, touching the small silver cross her grandmother had given her. It would stay with her throughout the deployment, a reminder of her purpose and her promise to herself about the kind of soldier she intended to be. As she packed her gear that final night, Sarah carefully arranged her medical supplies, checking and double-checking every item. Her rifle went in last, wrapped in a cloth and buried beneath her personal belongings. She hoped it would stay there for the entire deployment, unused and unnecessary. The transport plane waited on the tarmac the next morning, engines warming in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah shouldered her pack and walked toward her future, still believing that being a medic meant she would never have to choose between her principles and her survival. Afghanistan would test that belief in ways she never imagined possible. The heat hit Sarah like a physical blow as she stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Airfield. Even at dawn, the Afghan sun was merciless, and the thin mountain air made every breath feel insufficient. The landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and tan, broken only by distant mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the horizon. Forward Operating Base. Chapman sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills dotted with caves and ancient shepherd paths. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, prefab buildings, and canvas tents surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. Sarah counted at least 6 different checkpoints between the landing zone and the main compound. "Welcome to paradise," said Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, a stocky soldier from Ohio who had been in country for 8 months. He wore the 1,000-yard stare that Sarah would learn to recognize in veterans who had seen too much. "Hope you brought sunscreen and a sense of humor, because you're going to need both." Bravo Company consisted of 32 soldiers, mostly infantry with a few support personnel like Sarah. The commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Stone, was a no-nonsense West Point graduate who had earned her soldiers' respect through 2 previous deployments. During Sarah's briefing, Stone made the situation crystal clear. "This isn't a peacekeeping mission, Martinez. We're actively hunting Taliban fighters who have been hitting supply convoys and attacking village councils. They know we're here and they want us gone. Your job is to keep my soldiers breathing long enough to complete their missions." The base medic Sarah was replacing, Corporal David Kim, showed her around the medical station. It was better equipped than she had expected, with proper surgical instruments, blood supplies, and even a small X-ray machine. Kim was heading home after his tour ended, and Sarah could see both relief and anxiety in his eyes. "The fighting season is just starting," Kim explained as he walked her through the inventory. "Spring and summer are when things get busy. Last month we had 12 casualties, including 2 KIA. The Taliban have been using more sophisticated IEDs, and they're not afraid to engage in direct firefights." Sarah's first week passed quietly, giving her time to adjust to the routine. She treated minor injuries, heat exhaustion, and the occasional bout of food poisoning. The soldiers in her unit were initially skeptical of the new medic, testing her knowledge with hypothetical scenarios and watching how she handled stress. Sergeant Morrison, who served as the squad leader, seemed particularly doubtful. "No offense, Martinez, but you look like you've never seen real combat. When bullets start flying, I need to know you won't freeze up." "I won't let you down, Sergeant," Sarah replied, checking her medical supplies for the 3rd time that day. "I trained for this." The first real test came during a routine patrol to a village called Kalat. Intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were using the village as a supply route, and Bravo Company's mission was to conduct a presence patrol and gather information from local leaders. It should have been straightforward. The patrol consisted of 2 Humvees and 16 soldiers, including Sarah. She rode in the second vehicle, her medical bag secured beside her and her rifle tucked beneath the seat where she hoped it would stay. The village was only 8 kilometers from the base, but the road wound through several potential ambush sites. Village Elder Mahmoud welcomed the soldiers with cautious politeness, serving tea while Captain Stone asked questions about recent Taliban activity. The interpreter, a young Afghan man named Hassan, translated between Pashto and English as children, gathered to stare at the American soldiers. Sarah found herself relaxing despite the circumstances. The children reminded her of her brother Miguel at that age, curious and unafraid. She shared some candy from her MRE, earning giggles and shy smiles. This was the side of deployment she had hoped to experience, building relationships and helping people. The meeting with village leaders stretched longer than expected. Intelligence gathering was slow work, requiring patience and trust building that couldn't be rushed. Sarah used the time to treat a young boy's infected cut and give basic first aid supplies to the village's elderly medicine man, who seemed grateful for the assistance. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Captain Stone made the call to return to base. The patrol loaded back into their vehicles, spirits relatively high after a successful mission. Sarah settled into her seat, already thinking about the medical report she would need to file. The first IED detonated just as their convoy reached a narrow section of road flanked by high stone walls. The explosion lifted the lead Humvee completely off the ground, flipping it onto its side in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah felt the concussion wave hit their vehicle like a giant's fist, shattering windows and leaving her ears ringing. Contact. Contact, IED strike on Vehicle 1. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio as automatic weapons fire erupted from hidden positions in the surrounding buildings. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of RPGs as Taliban fighters launched a coordinated ambush. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She grabbed her medical bag and moved toward the overturned Humvee, staying low as bullets whined overhead. Inside the twisted metal, she could hear soldiers calling for help, their voices mixing pain with desperation. Private First Class Tony Garcia was trapped beneath the vehicle's turret, blood pooling beneath his head. Specialist Amanda Foster had compound fractures in both legs, bone visible through torn fabric. The driver, Corporal Michael Santos, was conscious but had taken shrapnel to his chest and was struggling to breathe. "Martinez, we need to move them now," Morrison shouted from behind a concrete barrier where he was returning fire. "We've got fighters positioning for a flanking maneuver." Sarah worked with mechanical precision, establishing airways and controlling bleeding while gunfire raged around her. She managed to extract Garcia first, dragging him to cover behind a low wall where she could properly assess his injuries. Head trauma, possible skull fracture, but breathing was stable. Foster came next, screaming as Sarah splinted her legs and administered morphine. The pain medication took effect quickly and Foster's breathing became less labored. Santos required the most work, with potential internal bleeding that needed immediate attention. As Sarah worked on Santos, she became aware that the firing pattern had changed. The Taliban fighters were moving closer, using the confusion of the ambush to advance on their position. Morrison and the other soldiers were running low on ammunition, their rate of fire decreasing noticeably. "Martinez!" Captain Stone's voice cut through the chaos. "How long do you need?" Sarah looked at her three patients, then at the approaching enemy positions marked by muzzle flashes and moving shadows. Santos needed surgery that she couldn't provide in the field, but moving him without proper stabilization could kill him. Foster was stable but immobile. Garcia was unconscious and would need constant monitoring. 10 more minutes, she called back, knowing they might not have 10 more seconds. The reality of her situation crystallized in that moment. Her medical training had prepared her to save lives under fire, but it hadn't prepared her for the moment when saving lives might require taking them. Her rifle remained strapped across her back, unused and almost forgotten as she focused on her wounded soldiers. But as Taliban fighters closed the distance, Sarah realized that her principles and her patients' lives were about to collide in ways she had never anticipated. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder, their voices carrying across the narrow street as they coordinated their assault. Sarah could hear them moving through the adjacent buildings, windows shattering as they knocked out glass to create better firing positions. The ambush was well planned and executed with military precision that surprised everyone in Bravo Company. "RPG, take cover," Morrison screamed as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked past their position, exploding against a wall 20 meters away. The blast showered them with concrete fragments and filled the air with choking dust. Sarah hunched over Corporal Santos, shielding him with her body while continuing to work on his chest wound. The shrapnel had punctured his lung, causing a pneumothorax that required immediate decompression. Her hands moved automatically, inserting a needle between his ribs to release the trapped air that was slowly suffocating him. Santos gasped as pressure relief allowed his lung to partially reinflate. His eyes focused on Sarah's face, recognition and gratitude mixing with pain. "Doc," he whispered, using the universal soldier nickname for medics. "Thank you." "Save your strength," Sarah replied, checking his pulse and blood pressure. Both were weak but steady. We're getting you out of here. From her left, Private Garcia began regaining consciousness, groaning as awareness brought pain. The head injury had left him confused and nauseous, but his pupils were responsive and equal. No immediate signs of severe brain damage, though he would need a CT scan once they reached the base hospital. Specialist Foster remained conscious despite her broken legs, using her rifle to provide covering fire from her prone position. Sarah had immobilized her fractures with inflatable splints, but Foster's face was gray with shock and blood loss. She needed surgery soon or risk losing both legs to infection and tissue death. Martinez. Captain Stone crawled over to their position, her uniform torn and bloody from a grazing bullet wound to her shoulder. QRF is 15 minutes out, but we need to hold this position. Can you move the wounded? Sarah assessed her patients quickly. Santos was too unstable to move without risking his life. Garcia could potentially be carried, but his head injury made jostling dangerous. Foster was immobilized by her leg fractures and couldn't walk even with assistance. Negative, Captain. Moving them now could kill them. We need to hold here until the quick reaction force arrives. Stone nodded grimly, then pointed toward the building across the street where muzzle flashes had been increasing in frequency. Taliban are massing for a final push. They want to overrun our position before reinforcements arrive. Morrison's squad is down to their last magazines. The mathematics of the situation were stark. 8 able-bodied soldiers with limited ammunition, facing an unknown number of Taliban fighters in prepared positions. 3 critically wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. No air support available due to civilian presence in the village. 15 minutes until help arrived, if the quick reaction force didn't encounter their own ambush along the way. Sarah had been in combat for less than 30 minutes, but already the theoretical scenarios from her training seemed naive and oversimplified. Real war was chaos and confusion, where split-second decisions carried life-and-death consequences, and the textbook answers didn't always apply. A burst of automatic fire shattered the wall above their heads, spraying everyone with stone chips and mortar dust. Sarah instinctively covered Santos with her body again, feeling fragments pepper her back and shoulders. When she raised her head, she saw Morrison gesturing frantically from across the street. "They're flanking us," he shouted over the gunfire, "coming through the alley on our right." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban fighters had identified the Americans' weakness, their inability to move wounded soldiers, and were exploiting it methodically. Sarah could hear movement in the buildings around them, footsteps on rooftops and whispered commands in Pashto. Captain Stone made a command decision. "Foster, can you cover the alley approach?" Foster grimaced but shifted her rifle toward the narrow passage between buildings. "Yes, ma'am. But I'm down to 2 magazines." "Garcia, how are you feeling?" Stone asked the injured soldier. Garcia struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through his skull. "Dizzy, but I can fight if needed. Keep your rifle ready, but don't move unless you absolutely have to," Stone ordered, then turned to Sarah. "Martinez, I need you to understand our situation. We have 3 options. Fight until the QRF arrives, try to move the wounded and risk losing them, or surrender and hope the Taliban honor the Geneva Convention." Sarah understood the unspoken 4th option that Captain Stone didn't want to voice. In some situations, wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated were given enough morphine to ease their pain before positions were abandoned. It was a horrible choice that commanders prayed they would never have to make. "The wounded stay with me," Sarah said firmly. "I won't abandon them." "That means you might have to do more than provide medical care," Stone replied, checking her ammunition. "Are you prepared for that?" Sarah's hand unconsciously moved toward the rifle strapped across her back. She had carried it for months, qualified with it, cleaned it religiously, but had never fired it with intent to kill. The weight of it felt different now, heavier and more significant than she remembered. Before she could answer, the tempo of gunfire increased dramatically. Taliban fighters had reached the alley that Foster was covering, and her rifle cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets moving through the shadows. Brass casings ejected from her weapon pinging against the stone wall behind her. "Contact right," Foster called out. "Multiple fighters, maybe 6 or 7. Morrison's position began taking sustained fire from the building across the street. forcing him to keep his head down. The careful aimed shots that had characterized the early stages of the firefight gave way to rapid suppressive fire, designed to keep the Americans pinned while other fighters maneuvered for better positions. Sarah could see the tactical situation unraveling. Her wounded soldiers needed constant medical attention, but the healthy soldiers needed every rifle they could get to hold their perimeter. The contradiction between her role as a healer and the reality of combat was becoming impossible to ignore. Corporal Santos grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes clear despite his injuries. "Doc, if it comes down to it, don't let them take us alive. I've heard what they do to prisoners." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. 3 wounded soldiers depending on her medical skills for survival, and possibly depending on her combat skills for protection. The principles she had held so firmly during training felt less solid now, complicated by the human faces looking to her for salvation. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching, but she could also hear Taliban fighters getting closer, their voices more confident as they sensed victory within reach. The next few minutes would determine whether her principles or her patients' lives would prove more important. The sound of helicopters grew louder, but Sarah knew from her training that the quick reaction force would need time to establish a landing zone and coordinate their assault. Time that her squad didn't have as Taliban fighters pressed their advantage, moving closer through the maze of buildings surrounding their position. Specialist Foster's rifle fell silent. Sarah looked over to see her frantically checking her weapon. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. Foster's eyes met Sarah's with desperate urgency. "I'm out, Doc. That was my last magazine." Private Garcia tried to raise his rifle but swayed dangerously, the head injury making him too dizzy to aim effectively. Blood seeped through the bandage Sarah had applied to his scalp, and his pupils showed signs of increased intracranial pressure. He needed immediate medical attention, not combat duty. "Garcia, stay down," Sarah ordered, pushing him gently back against the wall. "Keep pressure on that head wound." Captain Stone's voice carried across their position, strained with the weight of command. "Morrison, status report." "Down to my last magazine," Morrison called back. "Williams is hit and Jackson's weapon is jammed. We need support now." The tactical picture was collapsing faster than Sarah had thought possible. What had started as a manageable firefight was becoming a potential massacre as ammunition ran low and the Taliban fighters sensed weakness. The helicopter still sounded at least 5 minutes away, an eternity in combat time. Sarah found herself facing a moment that all the training in the world couldn't have prepared her for. Corporal Santos was stabilized but critical, needing constant monitoring to ensure his lung didn't collapse again. Private Garcia was semi-conscious with a traumatic brain injury that required immediate surgery. Specialist Foster had compound fractures and was going into shock despite the morphine. All 3 of her patients were completely dependent on her medical skills for survival, but they were also completely dependent on the squad's combat effectiveness for protection. And that effectiveness was rapidly diminishing as ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. The Taliban fighters had identified the Americans' weakness and were exploiting it methodically. Sarah could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their final assault. They knew the helicopters were coming and wanted to finish the job before reinforcements arrived. Allah Akbar. The war cry came from multiple directions as Taliban fighters began their coordinated rush. Sarah could see shadows moving between buildings, at least a dozen fighters converging on their position from 3 different directions. Captain Stone made the hardest decision of her military career. "Martinez, you need to pick up that rifle now. We're about to be overrun." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at her wounded soldiers, then at the rifle across her back. Every instinct screamed at her to continue providing medical care, to maintain her role as a healer rather than a warrior. But she could also see the tactical reality unfolding around them. Specialist Foster grabbed Sarah's arm with both hands, her voice urgent despite the pain medication. "Doc, if we die here, we all die, including us. You've got to fight." The sound of footsteps on gravel was getting closer. Taliban fighters were approaching their position from the alley that Foster had been covering, emboldened by the lack of return fire. Sarah could hear them talking in low voices, probably planning which direction to attack from first. Corporal Santos struggled to prop himself up against the wall, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes alert and determined. Martinez, I need you to listen to me. You've saved our lives with your medical skills, but that doesn't mean anything if we get captured or killed. Sometimes saving lives means taking lives. Sarah had heard those exact words from Captain Davis back at Fort Sam Houston, but they carried different weight now, with bullets flying overhead and wounded soldiers depending on her. The theoretical had become terrifyingly real in a matter of minutes. Private Garcia, despite his head injury, managed to focus on Sarah's face long enough to speak clearly. Doc, you're the best medic I've ever served with, but right now we need you to be a soldier too. The sound of metal scraping against stone came from the alley, definitely closer now. Sarah could see the barrel of an AK-47 poking around the corner of the building, testing for return fire that didn't come. The Taliban fighters were preparing for their final rush. Captain Stone's voice cut through the chaos with military authority. Martinez, that is a direct order. Pick up your weapon. Sarah's hands moved to her rifle almost without conscious thought, muscle memory from countless hours of training taking over. The weapon felt foreign and familiar at the same time, its weight both comforting and terrifying. She had cleaned it, maintained it, qualified with it, but had never truly expected to use it in anger. The safety clicked off with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, despite the gunfire around them. Sarah chambered a round, the mechanical action as automatic as checking a pulse or starting an IV line, but her hands were shaking in a way they never did during medical procedures. I can't, she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. I'm a medic. I don't kill people. Foster's grip on her arm tightened. You're also a soldier, Doc, and soldiers protect each other. The first Taliban fighter appeared in the alley mouth, moving quickly but cautiously. He was young, maybe 20, with a full beard and intense dark eyes. For a split second, Sarah saw him as a patient rather than an enemy, automatically assessing his movements for signs of injury or illness. Then she saw the rifle in his hands and the expression on his face, and reality crashed back. This wasn't a wounded soldier who needed her help. This was someone who intended to kill her and everyone she was sworn to protect. The Taliban fighter raised his weapon, and Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. Her finger moved to the trigger as training battled against conviction, medical ethics against military necessity. Behind her, Corporal Santos coughed up blood, a sign that his lung was possibly collapsing again. Private Garcia's breathing was becoming more labored, indicating increased pressure on his brain. Specialist Foster was going deeper into shock, her skin cold and clammy despite the Afghan heat. 3 lives hung in the balance, and Sarah Martinez had to decide who she really was in that moment. The sound of helicopters was getting louder but not loud enough. Help was coming but not soon enough. The Taliban fighter's rifle swung toward her position and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Sarah could see individual details with crystalline clarity. The worn wooden stock of his AK-47, the determination in his eyes, the way his finger tightened on the trigger. Her patients needed a medic to keep them alive. But first, they needed a soldier to keep them from being killed. Time crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. Sarah could see the Taliban fighter's finger tightening on his trigger, could hear Corporal Santos struggling to breathe behind her, could feel the weight of 3 lives depending on her next action. The contradiction between her principles and her duty collapsed into a single unavoidable choice. Her rifle came up with surprising steadiness, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The sight picture aligned exactly as she had been trained, front sight post centered in the rear aperture. Target acquisition automatic and precise. For months she had practiced this motion, never believing she would actually need it. The first shot took the Taliban fighter in the center of his chest, spinning him backward into the alley wall. Sarah felt the rifle's recoil against her shoulder, heard the brass casing hit the ground beside her, watched the man she had just shot slide down the wall, leaving a streak of blood on the stone. The sound of her rifle seemed to echo forever in the narrow street, louder than all the other gunfire combined. Sarah stared at the fallen fighter, a part of her mind automatically cataloging his injuries with clinical detachment. Center mass hit, likely damage to heart and lungs, probably fatal within minutes without immediate surgical intervention. Good shot, Doc, Morrison called from across the street. 2 more coming up behind him. Sarah's medical training warred with the reality of combat. Every instinct told her to rush forward and provide aid to the wounded man, to stop the bleeding and stabilize his breathing. but tactical necessity kept her behind cover as more Taliban fighters appeared in the alley. The second fighter learned from his companion's mistake, approaching more cautiously and using the buildings for cover. Sarah could see glimpses of movement in the shadows, but no clear shot presented itself. Her hands had stopped shaking once she started shooting, replaced by an odd sense of mechanical calm. "Martinez, can you get an angle on the alley?" Captain Stone called out, her own rifle trained on windows across the street where muzzle flashes had been appearing. Sarah shifted position slightly, using a gap in the stone wall to observe the narrow passage. The tactical situation had stabilized somewhat now that she was actively fighting, instead of just providing medical care. The Taliban fighters had lost their momentum when their initial rush was repelled. A rifle barrel poked around the corner of the building, followed by a careful eye checking for defenders. Sarah waited until the fighter committed to his movement, then fired twice in rapid succession. Both shots hit the corner of the building, spraying stone fragments and forcing the fighter back into cover. The engagement had evolved into a more traditional firefight, with both sides using cover and concealment while maneuvering for advantage. Sarah found herself thinking tactically for the first time, analyzing sight lines and fields of fire instead of just focusing on medical concerns. Behind her, Specialist Foster had propped herself up against a wall and was trying to reload her rifle with a magazine she had found in her gear. Despite her broken legs and blood loss, she was determined to contribute to the defense. "Doc, can you help me with this? My hands are shaking too much." Sarah quickly helped Foster insert the fresh magazine and chamber around, then returned to covering the alley approach. The wounded soldier's determination to keep fighting impressed her, even as her medical training worried about Foster pushing herself beyond her physical limits. Private Garcia had managed to find his rifle and was attempting to provide overwatch, though his head injury made sustained concentration difficult. "How many more are out there?" he asked, his voice slurred slightly from the concussion. "Unknown," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving her sector of responsibility. "But they've stopped rushing our position. That's good for us." The sound of helicopters was much louder now, and Sarah could see dust clouds in the distance where the quick reaction force was establishing their landing zone. Apache attack helicopters circled overhead like metal angels, their chain guns and missiles ready to provide close air support. Captain Stone's radio crackled to life. "Bravo 6, this is Hammer 2-1. We have visual on your position and are identifying hostile locations."
"Can you mark your position with smoke?"
"Negative smoke available," Stone replied. "We have 3 wounded and are pinned down by small arms fire from multiple buildings. Estimate 8 to 12 hostiles remaining." Sarah continued monitoring the alley while listening to the radio traffic. The professional military communications felt surreal after the chaos of close combat, but they represented hope. Help was finally close enough to matter. A Taliban fighter tried to sprint across the mouth of the alley, hoping to reach a better position before the helicopters could engage. Sarah tracked him with her rifle, leading the target the way she had been taught on the range. Her shot caught him mid-stride, dropping him in the open street. The clinical part of her mind noted that this fighter would survive with proper medical attention, the bullet having struck his leg rather than center mass. But there would be no medical attention coming from the Americans, and his own fighters were too busy trying to escape the approaching helicopters to help him. "Apache inbound," Morrison shouted as the distinctive sound of a chain gun began tearing through the air. The 30mm rounds chewed through concrete and steel like tissue paper, systematically destroying the Taliban fighting positions that had been identified from the air. The effect on enemy morale was immediate and decisive. Sarah could hear shouting in Pashto as Taliban fighters began withdrawing from their positions, some carrying wounded comrades while others fled individually. The carefully coordinated ambush was collapsing as American firepower finally arrived in overwhelming strength. Within minutes, the shooting had stopped entirely. Sarah found herself staring at the alley where she had killed her first enemy fighter, waiting for movement that didn't come. The sudden silence felt almost as violent as the gunfire had been, leaving her ears ringing and her heart pounding. "QRF is on the ground," Captain Stone announced. "Medevac helicopter inbound for our wounded." Sarah immediately returned to her primary role, checking on Santos, Garcia, and Foster. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the firefight was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and a strange sense of disconnection from what had just happened. Santos was stable but needed immediate surgery. Garcia's head injury required CT scans and neurological monitoring. Foster had lost more blood than Sarah was comfortable with and needed orthopedic surgery to repair her fractured legs. As she worked on her patients, Sarah became aware that her hands were steady and her clinical judgment was sharp. The trauma of combat hadn't impaired her medical skills, though she wondered what long-term effects it might have on her ability to be the healer she had always wanted to be. The medevac helicopter settled into the dust cloud kicked up by its rotors, bringing with it a full medical team and the promise of definitive care. Sarah briefed the flight medic on each patient's condition, speaking in the precise medical terminology that felt like returning to a familiar language after speaking in a foreign tongue. As her wounded soldiers were loaded onto stretchers, word of the ambush spread through Forward Operating Base Chapman faster than Sarah had expected. By the time she emerged from the debriefing session with Captain Stone and the intelligence officers, soldiers from other units were looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect that made her uncomfortable. The story had grown in the telling, as military stories often do. In some versions, Sarah had single-handedly fought off a dozen Taliban fighters while simultaneously performing surgery on her wounded patients. In others, she had transformed from a reluctant medic into a fierce warrior goddess who struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. That's not what happened, Sarah told Sergeant Morrison when he repeated one particularly embellished version he had heard from the motor pool. I did what I had to do, nothing more. But Morrison shook his head, his expression serious despite the grin on his face. Martinez, you don't get it. Half the soldiers on this base have been in firefights, but none of them had to choose between their principles and their duty the way you did yesterday. That takes a special kind of courage. Sarah wasn't sure she felt courageous. Mostly she felt confused and emotionally drained, as if the ambush had fundamentally altered her understanding of herself and her place in the military. The clean moral certainties that had guided her through training seemed naive and oversimplified in light of actual combat experience. 3 days after the ambush, Sarah received word that all 3 of her patients were recovering well. Corporal Santos had undergone successful surgery to repair his punctured lung and was expected to make a full recovery. Private Garcia's head injury was less severe than initially feared, with no permanent neurological damage anticipated. Specialist Foster faced months of rehabilitation for her fractured legs, but she would walk again. The news should have filled Sarah with pure satisfaction, but instead it triggered a complex mix of emotions. She had saved their lives through her medical skills, but she had also taken lives through her combat actions. Both achievements felt significant, but they seemed to exist in moral tension with each other. Captain Stone called Sarah into her office on the 4th day after the ambush. The commanding officer looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of weariness that came from making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Martinez, I've been thinking about what happened out there, Stone began, gesturing toward a chair across from her desk. You've been struggling with something since we got back, and I think I know what it is. Sarah sat down carefully, unsure what direction this conversation would take. She had enormous respect for Captain Stone, but she wasn't sure she was ready to discuss the emotional aftermath of her first kills. You're trying to reconcile 2 different parts of your identity, Stone continued. The healer and the warrior. You think they're incompatible, but I'm here to tell you they're not. Ma'am, I joined the army to save lives, not take them, Sarah replied. Everything I did in that ambush went against my fundamental beliefs about what it means to be a medic. Stone leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Martinez, do you know what the Hippocratic Oath says about doing no harm? First do no harm, Sarah recited automatically. It's the foundation of medical ethics. That's a common interpretation, but it's not exactly what Hippocrates wrote, Stone said. The actual text talks about using treatment to help the sick according to your ability and judgment, but never to do harm or injustice to anyone. The key phrase is, according to your ability and judgment. Sarah wasn't sure where this was leading, but she sensed that Captain Stone was building toward an important point. Your judgment in that ambush was that your patients would die if you didn't fight to protect them, Stone continued. Your ability as a soldier allowed you to neutralize threats that endangered their lives. You didn't violate your medical ethics, Martinez. You expanded them to include the reality of combat. The interpretation was compelling, but Sarah still felt uncertain. It doesn't feel that simple, ma'am. I killed people. That's not what medics are supposed to do. Medics aren't supposed to let their patients die either, Stone replied firmly. And that's what would have happened if you hadn't picked up your rifle. Sometimes being a healer requires being a protector. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about Captain Stone's words. The base routine continued around her, with patrols, training exercises, and the constant background tension of being in a combat zone. But something had fundamentally changed in how other soldiers related to her. The skepticism and testing that had characterized her first weeks in Afghanistan were completely gone, replaced by the kind of acceptance that came from shared combat experience. Soldiers who had previously questioned her commitment now sought her out for medical advice and personal conversations. "Doc, can you take a look at this?" became a common request. Whether the problem was a minor injury, a prescription question, or sometimes just someone who needed to talk to someone they trusted, Sarah found herself becoming not just the unit's medic, but something approaching a counselor and confidant. The respect was gratifying, but it came with unexpected pressure. Sarah realized that her actions during the ambush had created expectations about her willingness to fight that might not align with her true feelings about combat. She had proven she could kill when necessary, but that didn't mean she wanted to make it a regular practice. 2 months after the ambush, Sarah's unit was tasked with another village patrol, this time to a settlement called Marja, where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were planning attacks on coalition supply routes. The mission briefing felt familiar, but Sarah's emotional response was completely different. Where she had once approached patrols with nervous energy focused on potential medical emergencies, she now found herself also thinking tactically about potential threats in defensive positions. Her rifle rode more naturally across her back, and she caught herself checking ammunition and equipment with the same attention she had always devoted to medical supplies. "You're different," observed Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a military police officer who had joined Bravo Company the week before. "I've heard the stories about what happened in Kalat, but I can see it in how you carry yourself too." Sarah considered the observation as they loaded into their Humvees. Walsh was right, though Sarah hadn't fully recognized the change until someone else pointed it out. The ambush had altered not just her understanding of her role, but her fundamental approach to being a soldier. She was still a medic first, with saving lives as her primary mission. But she was also now a combat veteran who understood that sometimes saving lives required taking them, and that realization had shifted her perspective on everything from patrol preparation to threat assessment. As their convoy rolled out of the base gates, Sarah found herself automatically scanning the terrain for potential ambush sites, while simultaneously inventorying her medical supplies. The dual awareness felt natural rather than contradictory, as if the ambush had finally integrated 2 aspects of her military identity that had previously been in tension. The transformation wasn't complete, and Sarah suspected it might never be. But she was no longer the naive medic who believed she could serve effectively in a combat zone without ever using her weapon. She had become something more complex and arguably more effective. A healer who could also be a warrior when her patients' lives depended on it. 6 months after the ambush at Kalat, Sarah Martinez stood at the departure gate of Bagram Airfield, waiting for the transport that would take her home to Texas. Her deployment was over, but she knew the person boarding that plane would be fundamentally different from the idealistic young woman who had arrived in Afghanistan a year earlier. The Silver Star citation in her dress uniform pocket felt heavy with significance. The formal language described her actions as conspicuous, gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, but those words couldn't capture the internal transformation that had occurred. During those crucial minutes under fire, Captain Stone approached her at the gate, looking as tired as Sarah felt but carrying herself with the quiet satisfaction of a commander who had brought most of her soldiers home alive. "Martinez, I wanted to speak with you before you left." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, snapping to attention despite the informal setting. "At ease," Stone said with a slight smile. "I'm not here as your commanding officer. I'm here as someone who watched you grow into one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with." The praise still felt uncomfortable to Sarah, who continued to struggle with reconciling her pre-deployment beliefs with her combat actions. She had saved dozens of lives during her deployment, treated everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. and had become the kind of medic other soldiers trusted completely with their lives. But she had also killed 4 enemy fighters during 3 separate engagements following the Kalat ambush, each time because tactical circumstances required her to choose between her principles and her patient's survival. Each time she had chosen her patients. "Ma'am, I still don't know if what I did was right," Sarah admitted. "I became a medic to heal people, not to kill them." Stone's expression grew serious, the look of someone who had wrestled with similar moral complexities throughout her own career. "Martinez, do you know how many American soldiers are alive today because of your actions during this deployment?" Sarah shook her head. She had never tried to calculate the total number of lives she had saved through medical intervention versus the lives she had taken through combat action. 37, Stone said firmly. 37 soldiers who went home to their families instead of going home in flag-draped coffins, because you were there when they needed you most. And most of those saves had nothing to do with your rifle. The number surprised Sarah. She had known her medical interventions were significant, but she hadn't realized the scope of her impact on the unit's survival rate. "But it's not just about the numbers," Stone continued. "You changed how this entire company thought about combat medics. Before Kalat, medics were seen as valuable but vulnerable, someone to protect rather than someone who could contribute to protection. You proved that a medic could be both a healer and a fighter when circumstances demanded it." Sarah thought about the other medics who had rotated through the base during her deployment. She had noticed that they seemed more confident, more integrated into their unit's tactical planning, more willing to train with weapons even if they hoped never to use them. Perhaps her example had influenced military culture in ways she hadn't anticipated. "The contradiction you're feeling isn't a weakness," Stone added. "It's what makes you effective. You never forgot that taking life is serious business, so you only did it when absolutely necessary. But you also never forgot that your primary duty was to preserve life. So you did whatever was required to fulfill that duty." As Sarah's flight was called for boarding, she realized that Captain Stone had given her a framework for understanding her deployment that might allow her to move forward without constantly second-guessing her actions. She had been a healer who learned to fight, not a fighter who happened to have medical training. The flight home gave Sarah 12 hours to process the year behind her and prepare for the year ahead. She would be assigned to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, working in a hospital setting that would emphasize her medical skills rather than her combat abilities. But she knew she would never again be the kind of medic who saw those roles as completely separate. Her family met her at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, and Sarah was struck by how young and innocent they looked after a year of seeing war-hardened faces. Her brother Miguel had grown 3 inches and developed the confident swagger of a high school senior, but his eyes still held the gentle spirit she remembered. "Welcome home, Hermana," he said, embracing her carefully as if she might break. "Are you okay? You look different." Sarah considered how to answer that question. She was different in ways that would take years to fully understand, changed by experiences that couldn't be easily shared with people who hadn't lived through similar situations. But she was also fundamentally the same person who had left Texas 18 months earlier, driven by a desire to serve others and make a positive difference in the world. "I'm okay," she replied, meaning it for the first time since the ambush. Different, but okay. Her parents asked carefully about her deployment, clearly uncertain how much they wanted to know about their daughter's experiences in combat. Sarah found herself editing the stories instinctively, sharing enough detail to satisfy their curiosity without traumatizing them with the full reality of what she had seen and done. Over dinner that first night home, her father raised his beer in a toast. To Sarah, who served with honor and came home safe. To Sarah, her mother added, who kept her promise to bring everyone home. Sarah thought about the 3 soldiers she had saved during the Kalat ambush, all of whom had made full recoveries and returned to duty. She thought about the dozens of other wounded soldiers she had treated throughout her deployment, and the complex calculus of lives saved versus lives taken that had defined her service. She had kept her promise, though not in the way she had originally expected. She had brought soldiers home by healing their injuries and by fighting to protect them, when healing wasn't enough. The 2 roles had merged into something more complex but also more effective than either would have been alone. 6 weeks after returning home, Sarah received a letter from Specialist Foster, who was completing her rehabilitation at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington. The tone was informal but deeply grateful. Doc, I wanted you to know that I'm walking again thanks to you saving my life twice in the same day. The doctors here are amazed by the field medical care I received, and I always tell them it was because I had the best medic in the Army taking care of me. You showed me what it means to be both a healer and a warrior, and I'm applying for medic training myself when I'm cleared for full duty. I want to be able to save lives the way you saved mine. Thank you for everything. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where she kept her deployment mementos. Foster's words crystallized something that had been forming in Sarah's mind since returning home. Her experience in Afghanistan hadn't corrupted her identity as a healer, but had expanded it to include realities she hadn't previously understood. She was still the same person who had joined the Army to save lives rather than take them. But she was now also someone who understood that sometimes those goals required the same actions, and that recognizing that truth didn't diminish her commitment to healing, it deepened it. The contradiction that had once seemed impossible to resolve had become the foundation of a more mature and effective approach to military medicine. Sarah Martinez had learned that being a healer in a combat zone sometimes required being a warrior, and that lesson would guide the rest of her military career and the lives she would continue to save.